Hello everybody. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Abi and I'm the events manager at BESA. I'm really delighted to have the pleasure of chairing this next session with Wendy Berliner, who's co-author of this fantastic book, which we're going to be discussing now, called Great Minds and How to Grow Them. So just tell you a little bit about Wendy before we start off. She's currently Joint Chief Executive of the Education Media Centre, which for those of you who don't know it, is a London-based charity that works to increase public understanding of education research. She's also an award-winning journalist. She spent some time at The Guardian where she was education correspondent and news editor, lots of other roles, and her team won the prestigious Content Team of the Year award in the 2016 British Media Awards. She's also done millions more wonderful things, but because we're short of time, I won't read them all out. But for now, I think we'll just kind of move straight on and have a little discussion about this fantastic book. So I'm just going to ask Wendy a couple of questions, but I'd like to come out to the audience as well to see what you have to contribute to the discussion, points or questions, whatever it is that you'd like to kind of chip in. So I thought it might be useful, firstly, just for the benefit of people who haven't read the book, for you to just kind of kick off by telling us a little bit about it, what prompted you to write it, who it's aimed at, just kind of set the scene a little bit for us about the book.
Sure, okay. Well, lovely to be here, lovely to see such a packed and interested room as well. So the book is written for parents and it's a follow-on from another book which is about high-performance learning for educators and teachers of all kinds. Now that came out last year and was written by Professor Deborah Eyre, who's a long-term friend and colleague of myself. She's a specialist in advanced cognition. And she's developed a system called high-performance learning. Now, she knows that I'm incredibly interested in what parents can do because I think we only scratch the surface of what parents can do. And we should remember that schools are a fairly recent addition to society. It's not that long ago that all transmissions of knowledge were done by parents or the community. And some parents, many parents unfortunately, have sort of stepped back and just handed it over to the system, if you like. And as a result, many children don't reach their potential, particularly children from disadvantaged homes, but not just those. So she wanted a book that could bring these ideas about high-performance learning to the parental market. She wanted me to write it because I'm a journalist, I'm used to communicating in a way that everybody can understand, whereas the academic way of communicating can be distancing, and I think that's a problem generally about getting ideas across to a market. So that's why I got involved. My sort of lifelong sort of thing I've been interested in my overall career is why some children from similar homes do so much better than other children. And the research actually explains why, and it's distilled in this book with a kind of parental hands-on guide to how to use the research.
I was just wondering kind of just about the reaction that you've had to the book, because I'm not a parent, but I read the book and I got a little bit terrified if I were a parent because there's just, you know, it's amazing. There's so many kind of opportunities where you can talk to your children, engage them more in learning. There was a really good example that I liked about an aubergine, little kid in a supermarket being like, what's that, mummy? And you could either just ignore them and say, oh, don't worry, it's an aubergine, I'm busy, let's get on with our shopping. Or that could become a way of engaging them in some learning about all sorts of things. But it just sounded like that could be just exhausting. If you have your kids kind of asking you about everything and everything's learning, then where do you kind of stop? I wondered if you'd had a similar reaction from parents, whether they...
No, the opposite.
Okay.
Because the ones who are trying it are finding it ever so easy to incorporate in their day-to-day life. I mean, I was in a card shop the other day and I heard, it was a guy, a dad, he'd got a boy of, I don't know, 7 or 8 with him, and this card shop was also selling poster prints, and this bloke was obviously into art and was going on about how he was responding to particular pictures and how it made him feel. It was absolutely wonderful. But they were obviously there choosing cards, but they were just cruising past these posters. And he was saying, what do you think? What does that look like to you? And the child was responding in the same way. And he was very, very excited by it. And of course, that's the whole point. You learn yourself as a parent as you teach the child. I've done this with my own son. And I've been completely floored by his questions because there's lots of things I don't know. And I'll tell you one, and it was when he was 7, and he said to me, we've been talking about the Big Bang. Little boys are very interested in dinosaurs, and little girls, and the Big Bang and dinosaurs. And I'd been talking about, once there was nothing. I wish I hadn't. And he said he wanted to know what there was before there was nothing. So now, I didn't know, but that gave me and him the opportunity to talk about that and to look in books and the internet and to talk to his teacher, actually, who suggested contacting Stephen Hawking. We didn't at that time, but Michael was up for it. My little boy was up for it. So no, it's not exhausting. It's exciting. I worked full time while I was bringing him up, and in fact, it gives you the kind of learning opportunities that are there that you will miss because you're too busy doing the washing up or looking at your iPhone for tomorrow's meetings or whatever it is. And it doesn't take long, and it's just a state of mind that you have. And you don't say shut up, you say, God, that's interesting. Let's find out, even if you don't know.
That was another thing I found interesting in the book, that was saying that if you don't encourage that curiosity, kids just lose it.
They stop asking. Little children, preschool children ask hundreds of questions over the week. It's how we learn. It's how curiosity is so connected. If you look at the research about curiosity and high performance, it's compelling. The two are just, joined at the hip. But once they get to primary school, the numbers of questions children ask absolutely plummet. And it's because when they're in school, teachers there having to stay on piste to deliver certain learning outcomes. And if somebody comes up with a question like, what was there before there was nothing? He'll have to say, yes, let's move on to, very interesting question, but let's move on to this. And you've lost a learning opportunity there. So you have to carry it on at home, It's fun. It's terrific fun.
In the book, a lot is stressed about the importance of doing this early on with children, early on in life, and that curiosity kind of disappearing. And it did kind of worry me, and I thought, are kids doomed if their parents don't do all of this when they're young? Are they just lost? Is that it? Or
No, they're not. And that's because of this wonderful brain we all have. These brains which, well, even in adolescence, it's cutting-edge research now, which many of you may know about, but the huge amounts of synaptic pruning, the connections in the brain, are going on then. So the idea is to try and get as many synaptic connections in the brain by the time you're an adolescent. But you learn fast, this is new research, you learn faster at 18 than you do at 11. And you have the capacity to take on higher learning concepts, the high stuff, the deep end stuff, up until at least you're 70. So but the thing about doing well is it's about being able to be resilient when you don't do well. So if you bomb your A-levels, actually you're going to learn really, really fast at the age of 18 compared with what you were doing 2 years ago even. But if you haven't got any resilience because no one's taught you how to have a positive mindset over the years, you're going to think you're rubbish and end it. And you're not. The world's your oyster, just keep going.
You'd need 10 years to become an expert in something? Or?
Yeah, it's 10,000, it's the
10,000
hours, yeah. I mean, there's various sources of that, but that's for...
My mum was very happy because she was 70 and I told her it's okay, you can still become an expert at something. So
you can, yeah, we all can, we all can. Yes, I mean, that's research that's been going on for ages, but there's a bloke called Anders Ericsson, Professor Anders Ericsson at Florida State University. His thing is deliberate practice, and that if you do practice things that you're not quite good enough and always challenge yourself all the time, within 10,000 hours, you will be, well, an expert in whatever that is, whether it's golf swings or whatever.
I might come out to the audience for a little bit and get you involved and see if anyone wants to ask any questions.
I'm intrigued and fully support everything that you're saying, but I do quite a lot of work in the early years sector, and I'm very aware that children who are now entering nursery schools at the age of 3, the research that's been done suggests that their language ability isn't as advanced as it used to be, and also some of their social ability is actually not performing at the same level. And it's often from those disadvantaged families where the greatest problems are. So it's lovely the way you're saying it, but how do we persuade or educate or get involved with those families so that they can take on that role in a more positive way without feeling that they're being criticised? And the support networks of things like children's centres, which are rapidly disappearing, were opportunities to enable that to happen. So do you have any thoughts and solutions?
Well, I do actually. So clearly we know what's happened with Sure Start and the children's centres, but in America they've trialled and actually done quite a lot of work on this with these nurse practitioners. Have you come across these? So 0 to 2, you take families that may be at risk in terms of the children sort of not doing well at school. So, but this is 0 to 2 years old, and you work with those families, explaining how to talk to children, how to be with children. And that has actually yielded some very, very good results. I mean, I've seen projects here in this country where they're doing that. It's not called nurse practitioners, but I mean, I sat in on a morning in a really, really poor part of Peterborough, for example, where all the mothers there were at-risk mothers for various kinds of reasons. And what was happening there was the children were being brought in with them, and specialist play workers were playing with the children while the parents watched and understood gradually how to get learning opportunities out of play and how to talk and how to sort of be with your children. And you would think, many people would think, I'm not saying you, many people would think, oh, it's, you cannot break this cycle of deprivation. But I spent some time with a woman. She was about 38. She had a 3-year-old. She was a survivor of the most appalling domestic abuse and childhood abuse. And she was learning disabled herself. And yet her child wasn't learning disabled. It was a lovely little girl. And she said to me, I have trouble saying this because sometimes it just makes me want to cry. I just want something better for her, and I will learn anything I can so that it will be better for her. Now, not every person in a disadvantaged family is like that, but I think there's more than we think, and we need to reach out for them and actually put the money in at the beginning, because money put in at the beginning is then not put into the social services system, the prison system, because our prisons unfortunately are full of these cyclical problems of people who are poorly parented and who failed in education.
One of the things that I sort of picked up on as well, but how can you cultivate a great mind in your child if you don't have the knowledge yourself,
You're learning yourself at the same time. It's
but if you
magic.
don't have, because a lot of what's in this book is, it assumes that you know about geography or history, or you can engage your child in those things. But if you don't have that knowledge yourself, how are you to do that?
Because you go online. It's going back to what Michael, my son, asked about. What was the before nothing? Now, but other children, say, why is the sky blue, or why does the wind blow? You can Google things like that. How would you weigh an elephant? You can Google things like that. It's amazing what you can Google, and you can get answers, and you can I picked him up from school one day, and there was a rainbow, and he wanted to know about rainbows. But he particularly wanted to find the crock of gold at the end. He was that young, crock of gold at the end of the rainbow. So we didn't really have to go home there and then. We did have a few minutes. So we chased the rainbow. And during that time, I was talking to him, and I couldn't really remember, but I remembered enough about why the prism is split up like that. And when we got back, we looked it up. And most of what I'd said was wrong, actually, apart from the colours. So we were able to correct it. And that's another thing. You know, the child must be able to see that being wrong is okay, because you learn from being wrong as well.
A few jumbled thoughts. I hope it comes through as a question. But the previous session was all about everything you could measure. It was about investment. It was about learning through efficacy, all the stuff that you can do in classrooms. Whereas the synapses, all the things in our brain, are basically, we can't really measure them. We don't know when it goes right or wrong. And you would say, you talked about the mindset that's needed to overcome exams, but then you're talking about the mind that's successful, that does well in exams, where maybe that intrinsic part of your motivation is driving you away from that, and perhaps there needs to be more of a drive from these sort of research and these sort of findings to influence ultimately the way not only we assess, but the way that we perceive assessment, because it could be failing kids absolutely everywhere and setting them up for total failure, because you even refer to success as in passing an exam or getting, which I know you wouldn't mean to do, but that comes over, and I think that could be just something that, how on earth do we ever overcome that?
Indeed. I mean, we have tried to overcome it by having coursework and things like that, so that it's not all on a terminal examination. Now, that's because of Michael Gove, that's been changed and it's gone all back to terminal examinations. Unfortunately, it's the system we've got at the moment. It's completely imperfect, but it is the system we have at the moment, so we have to work towards that way. The issue I have is that the brain basically very quickly slips into a default mode. It's daydreaming when it's bored or when it's not engaging with content. So if you have a passionate teacher in front of you and who's really making you alive with the possibilities of what he or she is talking about, you don't wander and start looking out of the window. I spent lots of my classes staring out the window, frankly, because I was bored. Exams don't do anything but help you regurgitate what you've been able to garner in that time, or what you've been able to revise. We have a system that we have to use simply because it's the only one we've got. I hope to goodness that, in fact, this business, this industry might eventually come up with solutions for this, because we aren't doing the right way. Some kids are brilliant at passing exams because they've got a particular kind of memory set, and you know they don't panic and that kind of thing, and they really do show what they're capable of. But our exam system is very, very contrived anyway. Just to take my son again, I mean, he got a D for his AS level in English literature, and I sent him back to his teacher to say, what on earth's going on? And he said, oh, don't worry, you'll be fine, you'll get an A, but didn't tell him how. And I sent him back to see the head of sixth form, who was an English teacher, who looked at what he'd written and said, don't write this kind of thing, Michael, this is silly, this is far more than an examiner wants. They just want you to tick off certain points. Well, that's not about learning. I mean, he did go on to get an A star, but because he reduced what he talked about. Exactly. Now, that's not about learning, but it's what we've got and it's what we have to work with at the moment. No, it's not. But after the exams, we can.
It was interesting to hear you mention play, without wanting to get into the politics around funding and all the other bits and pieces. We know that that's one of the problems. We need the investment at the very start. Yeah. But as a suppliers association, one of the things I'd also say is we've heard about schools and colleges and even universities and international schools today. We haven't heard about all of the other places where play occurs. And one of those is things like after-school clubs. Mm-hmm. It's the play schemes that operate during the half terms in the summer. Mm-hmm. And that's actually a group of people that we actually need to keep in contact with as educationalists, because they are. Mm-hmm. If we go back to where I started doing play work with Wirral Play Council, fantastic charity, very underfunded at the moment. But you started with, let children ask questions.
Yeah.
And that was one of the first things you learnt on day one of your training, let children ask questions. And that seems to be missing at the moment from a lot of the things that we do. It's not just at early years, it has to go all the way through. Concentrate on play and let them ask questions through play, not just through curriculum.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I couldn't say it better, so I'm not going to. That's absolutely right.
Caroline?
I'm sitting here feeling increasingly guilty. The more you're saying.
No, you're not. Don't feel.
We do talk about things when we go shopping, and then I said, let's Google it when we go home, because I don't know the answer, and then I forget. So I'm feeling sort of bad because I forget constantly to follow up on that. I'm also now feeling bad because you've mentioned daydreaming, and one of my children is the biggest daydreamer in the world. So I'm now worried that I'm not kind of inspiring her as she's getting ready for school with kind of talking about lost kingdoms
We all need
and so
daydreaming.
on. So, and I will read your book, but could you give kind of just 3 quick tips, perhaps, in the meantime, for mums and dads, aunts and uncles and grandparents on what can we do to kind of take away the guilt and do things better?
I've got to say, don't feel guilty, because being a parent is one of the hardest jobs we ever do. It's the best job we ever do. Enough people already make us feel guilty about being not good at it. So don't. We're all imperfect. Bruno Bettelheim always talked about being a good enough parent, and that's good enough for me, frankly. But just going back to what you should... So one of the key things is curiosity. So if they ask questions, try and remember to answer them when you get back. But if you can't, eventually you will remember on something. So answer questions. That's because curiosity is linked with performance. Another thing is keeping their minds open. So a lot of children arrive at school with very fixed ideas. They may hate people who are poor, they may hate people who are black, they may hate people who are foreign, because they've learned the most appalling ideas at home. So as a parent, you have to stay open-minded, even if it challenges your own ideas, and by adolescence they will be challenging your ideas anyway, so you might as well get in the swing of it earlier. Because when you're open-minded to new ideas, which means you're building capacity to think and to learn. Another thing I would say is to be resilient, to teach resilience. So if a child, and you hear it all the time, if a child says, I'm rubbish at something, no, they're not. No one is rubbish at something. They may not be able to do it as well as they would like to do now, but you have to convince them that you believe enough in them that they will get better at this and they will learn how to do it. So that kind of resilience is really, really, really important. What else would I say? I would say be willing to defend your own ideas. So it's a sort of spin-off of open-mindedness, so encourage them to defend from very, very young. What do you think about this? How do you think this works? Do you think that's right? I mean really young. I mean preschool if necessary. Because again, that's driving logical development. And the Sherlock Holmes, I wonder why. You're trying to get them to think, I wonder why, in pretty much everything they do. Because that is that's academic, that's around academic development, so that's incredibly, incredibly useful. I could go on, should I go on?
Let's take Patrick's question.
Wendy, I heard you speak at the Battle of Ideas Festival on a panel at the Barbican. That was a discussion on cognitive science, which I know informs your book a lot. And I think I remember a stat at that session that more research into cognitive science and education has happened in the last decade than ever before in the history of mankind.
Yeah.
And it's a very emerging field.
Yes.
So I think we are, over the coming months and years, going to get a lot of stats and a lot of research coming out about how to grow great minds. I was hoping to get some advice from you about how to navigate that, because I think they will have the weight of science and evidence in a way that perhaps they didn't in the past. Yeah. But at the same time, there is a nervousness, of course, that we are going to end up seeing a lot of fads and a lot of conflicting evidence coming out. We've seen this with science in the past, of course. 1 week red wine gives you cancer, next week it's the secret to a long and happy life. So how can we avoid that happening in education due to the emergence of cognitive science? And what advice would you give us, as also the CEO of the Education Media Centre, to navigate that as suppliers?
Great question. It's tricky. I'll say that from the outset, and I'll just tell you why. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So it's very true. It's the learning sciences, or the cognitive sciences as they're known, are new. I mean, they really are new, and so it's untested. A lot of this stuff is... We didn't have IQ tests until 1909, for example. The idea of multiple intelligences came in during the 1990s. Professor Howard Gardner, Harvard, amazing education specialist at Harvard. And his idea was that there are all kinds of different intelligences. You can have verbal intelligence, you can have intrapersonal, interpersonal, you can have kinesthetic, or audio. There's about 7 basic ones. He now says there's far more. And what happened because of that, exactly what you said, a whole movement, a learning styles movement, grew up around that, which is now largely discredited, sort of 20 years later. It has huge amounts of critics saying it's not based in science, that it's... Howard Gardner always said it was a theory, but the scientists are now saying this is not based in science. And it's actually not his fault. He was challenging the original idea of IQ, which is really limiting. It says that, you've got some kind of number tattooed in your skull when you're expressed out of the birth canal, and you cannot change it one way or the other, which is absolute arrant nonsense. And it's not even what Binet, Alfred Binet, the French guy who came up with the idea, said. He always said it was plastic. So you have these things that are taken on by the system as though they're gospel, and they change the basic meaning of it because of it. So multiple intelligences, basically, it's a good idea to make you think. It's a provocative idea to make you think, but you don't button it down. The numbers of children who come up to me in schools in the 90s and say, I'm a kinesthetic learner. Really? And the other one I'd mention is Brain Gym, because that's a product that has gone around the world, and for those who don't know it, it's common sense. It's drink a lot of water because that's good for the brain, and also in breaks between lessons, do activities like star jumps. Get the blood coursing, and then there's this bit which you press brain buttons on your body. This is where it gets a bit odd, which is supposed to develop to pump blood into the brain. So that has been dismissed as pseudoscience so many times over the last 10, 15 years, and yet it's there in loads of schools because the children like it, because they like doing star jump. This is primary. They like doing star jumps. They like having water. So there's nothing wrong with that. And if it's on a wet Friday afternoon and it gets them thinking and concentrating, that's really, really good. So going back to your question, I think the best research is longitudinal research. And that's expensive because it's lifelong. But if you think about, IQ, in 1921, the first major test of IQ started over at Stanford. That's why it's called the Stanford Binet test, the IQ test. Just over 1,400 teenagers were selected from the Californian state system because they were thought to be brilliant, because in the IQ test they had at least 140 IQ. The chap who led this research was a man called Professor Lawrence Terman, and he was absolutely convinced, and his team were, that amongst those 1,400 would be some of the great thinkers of our age in the world. And he followed them across their whole lives, mainly dead now, but some of them are still alive. And none of them did become a great thinker. None of them. Many of them did well. They became lawyers or business people or teachers, doctors. But they didn't change the course of the world. He missed 2 who did. So 2 who were not clever enough, who missed the cut and weren't followed in the study, went on to win Nobel Prizes for physics. And I think that is a sign. Well, by the end of the research, it was thought that it was by then clear that the link between high performance in a snapshot test at a certain time has a very weak link between high performance in life. But that took all that time. I think what you do, just to finish this point, I think what you do is you watch where the really, really good research is going on and you take cognizance of that. So if you look at UCL here in London, for example, there are others, but just picking London, University College London, somebody like Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore, a young, wonderful brain scientist, she's doing the cutting edge, and her team is doing the cutting edge research, which is showing us about the adolescent brain and what we were just talking about, which will gradually impact on what happens in schools. So you watch where the good stuff's happening.
Just to follow up the IQ question, and just one of the teacher was saying nowadays children they are 5 years ahead. Their IQ is 5 years ahead of their EQ. Because of the Google, because of the internet, so their knowledge is far, more than what their EQ can handle. So as parents, how can we prepare that situation if the kids are asking too clever questions, and obviously they are not ready for it yet?
Well, I think IQ's been growing massively since the 30s everywhere, and that's largely due to improvements in nutrition and education, opportunities, like eventually TV and the internet, so opportunities to learn that are at your fingertips. EQ, I really do think you start in the nursery. In other words, as a parent, you have to start teaching good ways of behaving, really, and understanding and empathising, because the best leaders are always the most empathetic leaders. That's research on this. If you're some kind of psychopath, you cannot be a great leader. There's a few around the world at the moment. But I think as a parent, you start very, very young, and you really, really, not actually having children when you're very, very young, but you start talking to children. Is that nice? How would that make you feel? By 5, children really can have a fairly good handle on what it feels like if somebody's nasty to you, if the stuff that leads up to that moment when they get that feeling, that didn't feel very nice and I need to be able to talk about that. So it's absolutely in the home. Obviously parents vary in their ability to do this, but I do think it starts in the home, because in schools only have children for around about 15% of their waking hours. So it's tiny, the amount of time that actually is spent in school. And it's amazing what schools and teachers do as a result. But the family and the community and everything else around the children has so much to offer in the remaining 85% of their waking hours.
Okay, Cleo, do you want to ask the final question?
Thank you very much. Yes, I have a question about the differences between boys and girls, and reading your book was fascinating, but we keep talking about children and not about, and I think there are really just 2 examples of a boy and a girl, and especially today when we see in schools girls achieving a lot better than boys, and then going on to the workplace where it's still, mostly men running a lot of the world and businesses. And I was wondering if high performance learning was something that you thought was maybe missing in girls. Is that something we don't encourage as much, or how could high performance learning help in filling that gap?
Another great question. So back in the 70s, it was thought that girls were not as good at maths and science, that there was something in their brains that made them not so good at maths and science. A few generations ago, it was thought to educate girls was harmful to their health, that they would have the vapours and things like that. We've come a hell of a long way. There was equal opportunities legislation in the 70s and 80s that stopped all that. Now, girls are outperforming boys at every level of our school system, not just here in the UK, but abroad, across the world, across the developed world. I'm talking about where girls get the opportunity to go to school, and unfortunately, as we know, there are large parts of the world where girls don't. But where they do, they're outperforming, and it's boys who are on the catch-up thing now. They really, really are. So if anyone's a high performance, if any gender is a high performance gender at the moment, it's the female gender. There are worries about boys being left behind, but in fact boys are catching up again because they're very competitive, as are girls. So I think, the workplace is a different thing. I don't know whether you see the story today where it said that it'll be another 100 years before women actually achieve equal rights in the workplace. That's very unfortunate. I hope it's wrong. I hope it's much more quick than that. But we are talking about generational change that can't actually happen in a moment. And we have only had girls' education, certainly secondary education, since the end of the 19th century. So it's slow, but we're doing okay, I think.
That's a nice positive note to end on. I think we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. But just thank you so much, Wendy. And it was really, really, really thought-provoking. And thank you for all of your really interesting questions as well.